Hi, I am Brian Lepak, Chair of the Law Practice Management and Technology section of the Beverly Hills Bar Association. I would like to welcome you to our program today on behalf of myself and on behalf of Hillary Johns, who is the Chair of the Litigation section, who is also co-sponsoring this event. The program is entitled Use of Investigators in Litigation Matters. Our speaker today is Billy Belmont. Before I turn the program over to Mr. Belmont, I want to thank Charlie Ballard of Online Securities for being the chair of this program. I would want to let you know also that there are program materials that have been sent to you by email already. They will also be posted in the chat if you haven't received those materials. MCLE certificates will be sent to the attendees via email within 24 hours. So if you don't receive that, you might want to reach back to the Beverly Hills Bar Association. With regard to upcoming CLE programs being presented by the Beverly Hills Bar Association, we ask you to look to the website, bhba.org, to see if there's other programs you might be interested in, and also check your emails for program notices. If you have any ideas for future CLE programs, feel free to email me so that we can see if we can put such programs together. If you are interested in participating in the Law Practice Management and Technology section or in the litigation section, either email me or Ms. Johns to see what we can do to get you involved with these sections. If you have any questions during the program, feel free to post them in the chat or in the Q&A. I will try to look at them while Mr. Belmont is speaking to see if we can have Mr. Belmont address those questions. And with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Mr. Belmont. Thank you.
So thanks for allowing me to speak to the Beverly Hills Bar Association. My name is Bill Belmont. I manage the Belmont Group. We're a New York-based national investigation firm. We provide investigation due diligence services to law firms, corporations, and high net worth families. So this presentation today that we'll be discussing investigations, it's kind of broken down into two areas: due diligence, which is a part of every investigation. How much information is there available on an individual or organization? When you want to get that information, how can you get that information? And of course, do it ethically. And then the field investigation itself, what takes place in the field, what a field investigation involves. These will be the areas we'll be looking at. We'll start off talking about ethical investigations and then get into these different categories. First part on the ethical investigations is to make sure you know your investigator. You'd be surprised the number of times I'll receive a phone call from a lawyer asking us to work on a case because they just found out their investigator wasn't licensed. So that aspect is always important, to make sure who you're working with is licensed and professional, but also know a little bit about their background. Many times we'll get calls from lawyers who want us to work on a case, and the lawyer is so convinced he knows what he wants, but yet this is the only third time he's dealt with that situation. We may, as investigators, worked on the case hundreds of times and have all different thoughts and suggestions on how to handle the case. So I would suggest you should collaborate with your investigators. Give them an opportunity to weigh in on the different ways in which an issue can be addressed. And what I mean by as a customer service representative is you have to remember the witness that investigator may be going out and talking to, who at this time doesn't seem important, 5 or 6 years from now, that witness could be the key to your whole case. So we look at his investigations as we go out there, we're representing the lawyer or the client who's hired that law firm, and we have to keep that in mind. So important to ingratiate yourself when you get to a witness, that you conduct yourself professionally, respectfully, almost ingratiating yourself to that witness to get their cooperation. It's the same way where if you're outside counsel and the client calls you up and they have an internal investigation and the investigators go on site, you know by the end of the day that that general counsel is going to hear what impact that investigator made on that company's employees. And that will then reflect on you. So it's always important to make sure they're professional and they understand how to handle themselves when they're out there working in the public or with clients' employees. Now, the no contact rule under agency restriction, we understand if we did criminal law or we studied criminal law under the poisonous tree doctrine, anything that flowed from an improper action by a governmental agency was not admissible. That's not the way many states look at ethical violations. They'll look at the probative value of the information obtained. So although there may have been an ethical violation, the evidence obtained still might be able to be used in the case. And it's important to understand that, because the problem is, for instance, the most basic one is if someone is represented by counsel, you can't make contact with them. The parties can't. the attorney can't, and we can't. You can't, as an attorney, overcome that restriction by asking us to go ahead and make that contact with those individuals who are represented by counsel. Doing so, the investigator and the attorney may lose their license, although the evidence may still come in. And that's one of the ways that's important is many times we get calls to locate someone. You'll get a call, I'll get an email from a client. Hey, Bill, can you go locate so-and-so? The problem is that we have to know whether or not that person is a client, a witness, are they a represented party? Because we can still, as long as we don't make contact, we can gather all kinds of information about them. Just like if someone's a party to an action and their spouse is not, we can make contact with them. But it's important to know as investigators what the person is that we're looking for, because that impacts the tools we're going to use. Sometimes if we know the person's not represented by counsel, we will make contact and speak with them. Obviously, if they're represented by counsel, we can. So it's important to be fully comprehensive when you explain that to your investigator. And also, hopefully, the investigator is asking you those type of questions to gather that type of information.
Billy, can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
What if there's a restraining order on your client with regard to the other party, but say like in a divorce action, you want to find out what that other person is doing? Can an investigator still track and do some investigation on the other party despite the restraining order?
Yeah, there's no restrictions. Now, there's privacy issues, which you're not talking about. Obviously, you can't go into their home or go into private property. But the only restriction on the no contact rule is that we cannot make contact with them. But that doesn't stop us from watching and conducting surveillance, which is in public space anyway, or gathering information about them. Does that clarify that one, Bray?
Yep, thank you.
Also, if someone has questions, please, post them up. You don't have to wait to the end. If you're asking questions during the presentation, I know you're getting information that you're interested in having. So one of the biggest scandals that we had ethically where the term social engineering and pretexting came up was back in 2006 with Hewlett-Packard. The Hewlett-Packard board believed, the CEO believed someone was leaking information from the board out to the media, and they wanted to know who it was. And back in the day, when your cell phone records had itemized phone calls, that was a great investigative tool. Cell phones, even now with texting, are great tools, but everyone would be calling on their cell phones. You would see itemized calls. So what happened was they hired a security guy that hired an investigator. And the investigator went to the phone companies and pretended to be the actual board members. Said, hi, I'm so-and-so. Can you send me my cell phone bill? I want to see what it looks like. Can you send it to this new address? Obviously, that was a major violation. That was a fraud. There was indictments. Big scandal came out of that. A lot of people were fired out of that. But because of that, now there's laws, both federal and state laws, precluding you from getting access to cell phone records because of what took place at that event. So that's where the pretexting came in. Social engineering is a great investigative tool. That's where we gather all kinds of information on an individual prior to making contact with them. Same way before, when I was a trial attorney, the same way before I would go into a deposition, I would gather as much information as I could. Social engineering is the process of gathering all this information on an individual to understand them and the decisions they're going to make, and then making contact. And we'll talk more about that process as we get through the slides in the presentation. These will be the different areas under due diligence. We call it due diligence or vetting. Many people just call it background check information. So under background information, there's 4 things in the US you need to open up someone's life. And of course, California is one of the more restrictive states, especially with the GDPR coming in and trying to make it more and more difficult to access information and giving more rights to individuals of their privacy information. But of the 4 things, name, address, date of birth, and social. Once we get those 4 things, we can then begin the process of conducting due diligence on individuals. Now, although that may sound scary, the reality is we're very well regulated in our industry. As an attorney and as a private investigator, we get audited. So while we have access to information, we will be arbitrarily audited at different times and say, hey, why'd you pull this information? Why did you gather that information? We have to have justifications for doing it, and litigation-based is obviously one of the more common justifications for that. Outside the US, including Canada and the rest of the world, very difficult to gather information. There's nowhere where information is more easily accessible as the United States. And so when you start with the person's name, is what you usually get. And as investigators, we need 2 of those 4 things from you. So if you have a name and address, we'll generate the rest. If you have a name and date of birth, we can generate the rest. But it's important to be accurate with the information. So we hope to get some form of government identification or some verification of the person's spelling of their name through government identification. DMV records now post 9/11 and through the years and years of enhanced security are really trying to be very accurate in how they gather information on individuals. If you want those enhanced driver's license that the federal government will accept, you have to bring multiple forms of identification to get those. Those are a pretty good starting point when we can get access to that type of information. And accuracy matters. You know, if you're off with these systems that we have get access to, if you're off by one spelling of a letter, one number of a social or date of birth, the whole process won't work. So for instance, as any good trial attorney, I was taking notes last night on some recent cases we had. The name Crystal, was it spelled with an I or a Y? You get Steve a lot. Is it PH or is it with a V? We had a case where the person's name was Thomas and they kept spelling it as Thomas. And you find these mistakes in medical records, in pleadings, in police reports, in government records. We had a case recently where the name Mohammed was misspelled by the law firm representing Mohammed. In his own pleadings, they had misspelled his name with how they were spelling the first name. So I can't stress enough the importance of accuracy. Then, of course, you may come to me and say, hey, Bill, we have to find Joe Smith. He's at 123 Main Street. He's very important to our case. We do some research. We find out there's two Joe Smiths there. One is a senior, one is a junior. Hopefully the client has a sense of approximate age of which of those two individuals they're looking for. Same thing with maiden names. When you're pulling records on individuals, they don't automatically include a maiden name. So you may have to sometimes search it as though it's two different individuals, juniors and seniors. Foreign names. In fact, an hour before this phone call, I got a call for a case in Sonoma involving some individuals from Vietnam. And the way their names are being spelled is the middle name and the last name is hyphenated. Or is that last name two names that are hyphenated? It's very important to understand the difference when you're getting into these systems. And I spend a lot of time stressing this because I cannot emphasize enough the number of times we get information from clients that is inaccurate on the individuals that we're looking for. Date of birth. You know, someone's date of birth is on November 5th, but someone then changes that to a numerical expression and writes it as 5/11. Social security numbers are very important, especially when it comes to financial data, and it's a great tool to verify an individual's identification. That's what we find that most common. Background information, I talk about address history a lot. It's important to know what someone's address history because there is no magic potion, magic Google system to gather information on individuals. The most accurate information comes from the county level. So you need that address history on an individual so you know where to look. So many times we get a call, hey, Bill, we had one recently in LA. We're doing a cannabis deal. Money's coming in. Can you just do a background check on this individual? Well, I say, wait a minute. What is the purpose of the investment? Are they investing in you or are you investing in them? And then I say, how far back do you want to go? They go just California. But then when I look at this individual's address history, in the last 10 years, they lived in 4 different states. So now maybe we want to look to see what was going on with that individual in those states. So address history is very important. Questionnaire and release. While you don't need a questionnaire and release to do these due diligence investigations, I find them to be a great tool. I find it very useful to go up to an individual and say, listen, you're investing in our business or we're investing with you. I want you to know that we need to do a background check. We want to vet you to make sure there's nothing that concerns us. Due diligence is important. We recently had a case in Manhattan where a woman was old school money. She was personally guaranteeing $13 million on a business deal. And the client said, Bill, we got to vet her. I said, fine, here's the questionnaire, have her fill it out. And this woman's attorney got back to us and said, listen, does she really have to fill this out? Everybody knows who she is. And the client said to me, Bill, what are we going to do? And I said, simply this. And I typed an email and I said, send this back to her attorney. He sent it back to the attorney. And the next day she filled out the form. And my email simply said this: everybody knew Madoff. And since Madoff, transparency and corporate governance has been a big priority for people. But I will tell you, this is not consistent. We have a case we're working on. It's an $85 million real estate fraud. $85 million. And what happened was, although the compliance guy suggested to the hedge fund that they come to us to do the vetting, the sales guy said, nah, we know this individual will be fine. We're just going to move forward. And this individual, a Google and criminal search would have told me not to go further on this individual. They chose not to do that. And now they're in a situation now where they're trying to recoup the money from that situation. Again, I talk about cannabis. New York has legalized cannabis. Colorado, California, a lot of places have been in it for a while. These questionnaires and releases are very common. I think they're a useful tool because once you hand that to a person, they're on notice you're going to be looking. And if they mislead you on that document, that's a great flag later on if you want to break the deal or if you end up in litigation with those individuals. Now, a lot of the slides, I call them lead generators. The reason we're using these slides is for things for you to be thinking about should you need an investigation. So under business affiliations, might you need to research an individual's former and current associates? What might be the reason for that? Is there some undisclosed relationships that if you could identify would be useful to your case? I love vendors, suppliers, and customers. You'd be surprised how much information is available in this area. Excuse me, especially in asset searches, which we've seen a major increase since the beginning of COVID. The vendors, suppliers, and customers of the debtor have a great deal of information on how money flows. They also have a great deal of information what happens in a workplace. You'd be surprised how much the FedEx guy or the UPS gal who comes every day to the office sees and hears things and has useful information. Not just in a corporate environment, the one that goes to a house in a suburban area who's constantly making deliveries has information also. Business affiliations is great to finding hidden assets or silent roles. We've had cases where individuals trying to not let it be known or disclose the fact that they're running a company or they have an ownership in a company. Well, if you can identify that silent role, that could be useful to your case. Conflicts of interest are very big issues too. Another place where business records come in is sometimes you have to think outside the box. We had a client that had leased property to an individual in Florida, about $1 million worth of property that was not returned. Our job was to locate that individual, and it wasn't a debt. So we were really, how should I say, we were life coaches. We were going to motivate that debtor to return the property, obviously legally and ethically, but try and get them to realize that property should be returned and try to avoid the strenuous cost of litigation. So we went down to Miami. We were looking for the individual, and we could not find them. We had the address. All my records were showing to me they should be at this address. We could not find them. I'm like, this doesn't make sense. We got to look further. So the problem with this individual, as I told you on the last slide, was he was from Latin America, and he used 5 different first names in different combinations to create his name. So sometimes it was 3 words, 3 names, 5 names, hyphenated. Very difficult to get a comprehensive, conclusive due diligence done on him for that reason. So I thought, let's look for business records. Maybe we'll get lucky that way. So we did a business search for him, and we found out he had a female business partner. And then we said, let's just see where she is. Maybe she'll get us some information. And as soon as we did our due diligence on this female business associate, that was the string that unraveled the entire case for us. We found out that she had been arrested and realized he had been arrested. And again, using a different combination of his names when he was initially arrested. They were involved in a very large international steroid criminal ring involving Russia. And so that's at least where he was. As a point of information, at that point in the case, we were able to go to the U.S. Attorney's Office and say, hey, I know you're going to seize all his property, but $1 million of that property is ours. We identified the property. The U.S. Attorney's Office identifies us as innocent owners, puts it to the side. We can get it back, but we will have to wait till the conclusion of the case. And that is, in fact, what happened in that particular case. So litigation is what I call one of the big 3. The big 3 are where the 3 areas you're most commonly going to find those red flags, that information that you're concerned about an individual. It'll be litigation, criminal records, and then social media or news media. And we'll go into those. Again, address history is important. You're looking for those records. You got to know what counties you're going to look for. If you're looking at somebody in San Francisco and they got cases in LA, you're not going to know about it unless you look. So knowing the counties is important. It also works the other way. Once you know there's a case somewhere, maybe you want to start digging around in that county about that individual. And you want to look in all different jurisdictions, local courts, surrogate courts, family courts, federal level, and state level. And here's the issue with the name. You know, the more common your name, the more false positives you're going to get a hit. So if you're looking up a Michael Smith, it's going to be very difficult to do a civil search just off of Michael Smith. You're going to get lots of hits. Then you're going to have to pull that file to identify if it's your Michael Smith, maybe by an affidavit of service. So I guess we keep in mind this, if you're going to have children and you think they're going to be criminals, try give them very common names will help the process. But again, unique names will save time on the cost and time involved in an investigation. And you're looking at not just the active cases. Look at closed cases. And a closed case from 3 or 4 years ago can have pleadings, can have an affidavit in there. There can be motions in there, a lot of useful information on the individuals or corporations you're looking at. And the same thing when it comes to judgments and liens. I use that term a lot, as I mentioned, lead generator. What leads could we get based upon what we're finding? Someone has a judgment other than a default judgment, because that tells us something too. But if there's a judgment on a case and it went to trial, there's going to be a lot of information. What was it that they couldn't negotiate when we know that 99% of cases don't go to trial? Why did this one go? And why is there a lien? What's the underlying circumstances, whether our subject's the debtor or creditor on that lien? So there's a great deal of information that comes out of these particular areas. And bankruptcy filings. Most of the time, we're finding individuals as debtors, but you will find a lot of good information about an individual's business when you find them as a creditor on a bankruptcy filing. Same thing with UCCs, what collateral they put up. We're finding a lot in this particular area with PPP loans where people say they have no money, and we're finding out how much money they got under the PPP. But again, all different areas to lead generators. And divorce proceedings. Hell hath no fury like a spouse that's been burned. So a lot of times, depending on the nature of litigation, this could be a great source of information. And sometimes it feels uncomfortable, but that's the reality. The reality of the case is when you're conducting an investigation, you have to gather information. So we had a case a couple of months ago in the Seattle area, and I suggested to the client that maybe we should talk to the former spouse. And they said to me, well, Bill, I don't know. They've been divorced for 15 years. Do you think it really will be helpful? And I said, it'll definitely be helpful because there's no greater documentary. There's no person documenting your life better than your former spouse. They'll know every vacation you went on, every job you had, every post on Facebook, everything you've put on Instagram. They have followed that, they have trolled that, and they are great sources of information. Maybe they're not, but again, this is all lead generators. And contacting a litigation adversary, keeping in mind that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. How much information you'll get. And a perfect example of that is we represented a company in Connecticut that was in litigation. It was a family business, a movie theater. They were in litigation with a large national chain, and they were very frustrated by the way the negotiations were going. They couldn't understand why things were going the way they did. My suggestion was, let's do some litigation on the national chain. Maybe we'll gather some information. And it worked out because we found another family movie theater down in Philadelphia that was similarly situated to the family in Connecticut. And so we were able to put them together, and they were able to collaborate and strategize on how they were going to handle their situation with that national chain. So that's just one example of how that information can be useful. Now, property records, again, going back to address history. Property records will give you an address history. Address history tells you where to look for property. Great place where you can find roommates, neighbors, people you want to interview. Great lead on assets. Do they own property? Do they own anything on the property? Is it vacant property? Now, the warehouse example, so it's very common in asset search. It's one of the first places you go. We had a counterfeiting case where, and this was back in the day when people were doing counterfeiting on the street. Much now it's done on the internet. That time they were doing hand-to-hand selling the products on the street. We couldn't find out where it was being made and manufactured from or distributed from. So we said, you know what? Let's just get down the license plates. Let's follow the guys who were involved with the better cars. We figured they would be the leaders of the organization, the criminal enterprise. We followed those individuals. We identified their homes. We identified them, and we started opening up their lives. And in the process of doing that, we identified that they owned some property. We went to that property location where we, in fact, found the warehouse, which inside the warehouse had the product that they were using for counterfeiting, and that made the whole case. So sometimes, again, as we in the early example, you have to think outside the box to get to where you want to get to in some cases. So news and media, another part of the big three, we get information. There's all kinds of information that you're going to find there. Again, as we mentioned earlier with civil litigation, the more common the name, the more difficulty you're going to have in breaking down if that's the individual you're looking for. But it's a great place for information. And it's newspapers, it's magazines, it's on the local level. You have these local village and town and city papers that don't go anywhere but to the 10 or 20,000 people in those small towns. There's a lot of useful information in there. Many times these papers now have, the electronic versions have a comment section. We live in a day and age now between TikTok and Facebook and newspapers. Everybody has something to say. They're all keyboard warriors. And you want to look for information in that comment section. We'll talk about it in a little bit. And again, reverting back to my trial days, I was taking notes last night on recent cases. We have found very useful information in the finance industry, medical, legal, real estate, fashion and entertainment. In these periodicals, in these industry magazines or newspapers, you can find information about the individuals that you're looking for. And it's a great place to find out about life events. If someone had gotten married, if they got a new job, if they got a promotion, unions they belong to, charities they help out, their political views and their participation in politics and so forth. And so let me give you some examples of that. And I know I'm going I'm speaking quickly like most New Yorkers do, but I'm trying to pile as much information in as I can in that hour. So we had one case with an individual we're doing some due diligence on, and his resume had indicated that he had graduated from school in Vermont. And as we know, most people just put the year they graduated and the school they went to. I myself had gone to 3 different schools by the time I had graduated. So even though it shows my date of graduation, unless I disclose that, which I do, you wouldn't know that. So we looked at this individual, and his name was not overly unique, but not very common. And we found a news story that indicated that someone about his age, when they were in college, had assaulted a homeless person. And although they were arrested, the case was not, the individual did not receive a criminal record, so it didn't show up in public records because the homeless person wasn't able to participate in the prosecution. There was no civil case because no one pro bono the homeless person in suing this individual. And so we weren't sure if it was that individual. We did some further digging, and we found that it was in fact our individual. And what he did was he committed this act. He then transferred out of the school because the school kicked him out, and he transferred to another to the school up in Vermont and graduated from there. And on his resume for the rest of his life, he just put the school he graduated from the year. Nobody thought to say how many years you were there or what happened beforehand. So again, had it not been for the news story, the criminal and civil litigation didn't come up, but we were able to catch it, taking advantage of this opportunity. We had another case. We had worked an asbestos case. And if there's any other attorneys who have worked those cases can take it back to the 60s, to the 70s, with cobwebs and old file boxes. None of that stuff is electronically available. So working those cases is difficult, and finding anyone with useful information is also difficult. But by doing a media search for individuals, we actually found a woman's obituary that identified her as a bookkeeper for the company. And luckily, she hadn't recently died when we came across the obituary, but we were able to call the family and say, hey, do you mind? Does she have any of her old paperwork from the company? Do you mind if we come and take a look at that? So another example how media comes into play. And some of them are very simple. Some of them are very simple home runs from an investigation standpoint. We had a fraud case where the director of a company was thought to be in cahoots committing a fraud with an outside vendor. And they claimed they didn't know each other and knew nothing about each other. Very quickly into a media search, we found them in a photograph at a charity event, which was a year before, with the arms around each other, 3 sheets to the wind at this event, happily smiling and clearly knowing each other. So that quickly unraveled their little conspiracy. And it's not always these smoking guns, these nefarious acts. We've had lots of cases with individuals that are high profile who are quoted, whether they're quoted about their industry or the political environment or where they think their industry is going. And it's been on more than a few occasions that when they interview for a job or when they meet with the people they're investing with or who are going to invest with them, they give them one perspective on where the industry is going. However, when you do their media search and you pull up the articles, you see a very different perspective that they have. And so clearly they were changing what they had to say so they can get the money in, but it wasn't a true, accurate assessment of what their views were. So that's an area you wouldn't necessarily think you'd find useful information. But again, it does come up in the media. So now looking at the internet with Google. Google is everybody's favorite private investigator. So hopefully that doesn't put us out of business, but it's a great starting tool. People are using it for employment. They're using it for whether they should or shouldn't, they're still doing it. People use it for dating and for colleges. And it is a decent tool. A couple, tricks I will give you from the investigative world on Google is, for one thing, don't shy away after page 2 or 3. Again, as we know, the more common the name, as we've been discussing, the more false positives you'll get. But you'd be surprised how you think you're seeing your individual on 1 and 2, and then by the time you get to page 3, they've dropped off. You go, okay, I'll stop. You'll find more information on page 6, 7, 8, 9 on those individuals. Another little trick of the trade that many know about, so I'm not sure it's a trick, is you also want to Google an individual's email address and their phone number, especially those involved in, I won't just say criminal acts, but let's say in bad acts, bad actors who don't want people to know their name, but still want to be identified and are not the brightest in the world, will communicate with people by their email address or their cell phone number. They don't want to get a burner phone or a second phone. So they'll post things and they'll do things, and to be contacted, they'll utilize their email or cell phone number, which is a great way to track and identify who they are. And again, for us in the investigative world, we love the fact that people are keyboard warriors, that they can't help but post things on social media. People will tell you, they're checking in at a restaurant, where they go to the gym, what time they're walking their dog, when they're going on vacation. Just think how much information is available on both the professional sites and the networking sites. And I had put down here to talk about Facebook and Instagram, but just think about TikTok now, how big that's grown, in the comments section where people are putting information. Now, a lot of times the information you find in these particular places is not accurate information. It doesn't matter to us as investigators. Even lies can be lead generators for us. It's our job to go out there and gather the information and then determine whether it's accurate or not. But even a lie is something we're going to follow up on. It's a great way to locate people. Locate investigations is a large part of our industry. Locating people, social media is a great resource for that. In fact, we had a case once where a client needed to serve an individual and they couldn't find the individual. And within a few minutes of our search on social media, which is amazing they couldn't find him, this individual was on social media promoting their workouts. So not only did they have pictures of themselves and of their different body parts, they actually posted what gyms they went to and the days they were going to the gym and what body parts they were working. So if it was Wednesday, we knew at Friday at 3 o'clock, they were going to do their chest workout at the gym. Pretty easy to show up there, identify that location for the client and let their process server go out and do that. High school reunion was a pretty creative way. A lot of times you got to get creative with your cases. You're gathering information on an individual. You find out from social media that they're going to be attending a high school reunion at a public place. Maybe it's a hotel. Nobody's going to know who you are if you show up there. You walk around the room like you're someone's spouse. Even if it's in litigation, you won't contact the actual subject, but think about the information you can gather talking to other people. Maybe just being in the room and listening to conversations, what might come up. So useful information. Also, it's a great place for a photograph. You want a photograph of an individual, especially if you're going to do surveillance, social media is a great place for that, as well as for coming up with employment information. The other thing to keep in mind is it never goes away. Remember when we first learned to use computers and they told us if you hit delete, it doesn't really go away? Same thing with the internet. Once it gets out there, it doesn't go away. I went in to meet with some private equity guys that needed some due diligence, and it came to me from a good client, so I wasn't concerned about vetting them before I met with them because this was just a meeting. So I quickly did a quick search, and one of the first things that came up on one of the individuals who had a very unique last name was a marijuana arrest they had in New Jersey. And so after the meeting, he asked me, hey, Bill, can I talk to you for a second? And we went off to the side. And before he says anything, I said to him, you probably want to talk about that marijuana arrest. And I feel bad because he was 21 years old at the time and his face dropped and he wanted to know how he can get rid of it. The problem is you can't get rid of it. What these companies are doing out there when they're promoting things, all they're doing is moving you further down, in essence, creating fake news. They're getting you off of page 1, trying to get you to page 8 or 9. But once it's there, it's there. And now what I mean about comments and blogs is the fact that lies can be lead generators. So for instance, there was a story here in New York that took place. An individual got arrested. And at the end of the online story, there's a comment section. And this was an individual who was arrested for stealing money from his company. And people were putting comments up there like, oh, good for him, took one for the people. Someone else would be like, oh, that's so wrong, I hope he goes to jail. But someone else posted, yeah, I remember that guy. 3 years ago when he worked at ABC Corporation, he got in trouble there too. That could be a lie, but that's a lead for us. That's a lead generator. And so all these postings that you see in the comments and these blogs people put out there, they may not take us anywhere, but as investigators, they're great lead generators. The restricted activities I just had to put out there because it's a story that if you saw it in a movie, you wouldn't believe it. This happened to have been a personal injury action where an individual claimed he had no use of his right arm and shoulder. And that's what his lawsuit was about. He was suing a doctor. A quick internet search for us found that he was participating in a football league. And the football league not only had his statistics up there every week after he played, and he was quarterback, by the way, it not only had his statistics up there, you could find photographs and videos of him participating in those activities. After testifying at a deposition, he couldn't do anything. So, and then under ethical alert, as we talked about, just to keep in mind, if someone's engaged by counsel, you can't make contact with them, nor can you go to their Facebook page and ask to be friends with them. And you can't ask me to go to their Facebook page and be friends with them. Luckily, most people are more than happy to put their life out into the public domain, and you can find that information simply by Googling or going to Facebook, in which case you can find that information. What also you're finding in different states have different rules from the courts, though. If you think there's useful information on a social media site and the privacy restrictions of that individual are precluding you from seeing it, you can make a good faith basis to the court that that information exists, you should be allowed to see it. And they're simply changing the privacy settings shouldn't preclude you from having access to that. And the courts are warming up to that because the reality is the information is there. They posted it. Simply changing the privacy settings doesn't diminish the value of that information. Criminal records. Got to know how it goes. New York State, it's statewide. California, it's county by county. So someone could be committing an armed robbery and convicted in LA, but if you check for them up north, you're not going to find out. You look for that, you run them in San Diego, you're not going to find it. So California does not have a statewide criminal search. Again, why we like to do media, social media, criminal, and civil. It is a nice coverage of all the different areas, because a lot of times someone's arrest will be published in a newspaper. While their arrest is not public information from the courts or from the law enforcement agencies, the news story still stays out there. And again, most criminal records, in fact, all criminal records, off of spelling and date of birth. So accuracy is very important. Disclosure rules vary. New York State, for instance, you can have all the violations you want. They will not disclose that. So if you're smoking marijuana, and of course that's been deregulated in New York, or people came out of bars when they were in college and they urinated in public and got a ticket for that, and they were convicted of it, New York State will not release violations as part of their public disclosure rules. So each state has different rules of what they'll disclose and what they won't. California is becoming more and more restrictive. Those that practice employment law understand that now sometimes even with a conviction, that can't be used in the process of employment, but that's for another presentation. So understanding the difference between arrest and conviction when that's disclosed, knowing when to get police reports and court files. Not every time the court file will have the police records. You may want to go to the arresting agency and get those files also. The words sealed and expunged. Some states will allow you to seal the records, in which case some states, the moment your case is dismissed, the moment you're found not guilty, they seal that file, nobody gets access to it. Depending upon who's asking you, you may still have to indicate you've been arrested, but the file has been sealed. Expunged is a term some states use to allow you to say it makes you whole again. So some people believe if their record's been expunged, they can claim they haven't been arrested. And again, photographs are important. And this is a great place for us to go to get photographs, especially if we're going to need to do surveillances. Government agencies, I'm going to just push through this. These are areas you want to keep in mind when you're looking for records. So the Patriot Act was great for our business. You have to regulate where your money's going. So whenever there's a business deal and money's flowing back and forth, whether outside the country or inside the country, we're often used to come vet as we're discussing. And check on all levels, federal, state, county, local, regulatory violations, applications, and permits. I'll talk about Sarbanes-Oxley hotlines in a minute. But in essence, the anonymous hotline means that if you're facing federal charges and you have an anonymous hotline, it will lower your sentence under the federal sentencing guidelines. But keep in mind, government agencies can be great sources of information. I'm just looking at the clock and measuring my time. Theft of trade secrets. I put this up just the importance of understanding when we work on these competitive intelligence cases or theft of trade secrets, it's rarely because the technology has failed. It is usually human error, not common error. It's just important if it relates to you or your clients to make sure people are vigilant. It's the complacency that's the problem. Just imagine you're in a large law firm and you have a trust and estates department and a litigation department. And they don't really know each other. One of those attorneys would never really be in the other person's office. But at the end of the day, in your firm, there's a cleaning crew coming in and going into everybody's office. And nobody's questioning that individual who's in the office. How much do you think I would have to pay that cleaning crew person to take some pictures or download some information for me about what was in your office? So I just wanted to touch on that part to keep that part in mind about the importance of that, of shredding information. My firm is totally paperless. So everything we have is saved, secured, and put up into the cloud all electronically to avoid certain situations like that. And again, just to touch on another area, workplace investigations. I love anonymous hotlines. I love that we get calls. Just like I gave the example before about the news story in the comments section where someone said, oh, I remember that guy from ABC. Something for us to look at. Now, a lot of clients don't like these because they call it the whiner line. People will call up and say the office is too hot, it's too cold, the boss isn't nice to me. I, of course, think all information is good. So as much information as they get, I like to have it, and then we can disseminate it and decide whether it's good or bad information. So if someone calls up and says, hey, Johnny's stealing from the company, maybe from a due diligence standpoint, there's nothing we can do with that. So they'll call me and say, Bill, can you investigate this? Probably not. But if they call up and say, hey, every day at 3:00, Johnny's downloading information and going to the Starbucks to meet somebody with that information, now we have a good lead. Now our due diligence tells us we can follow up on that. So I'm big on the anonymous hotlines. The other thing I put in about the listen and respond was just simply on all the Me Too related investigations we have, so many times it was not about the employee wanting to have massive changes or litigation or people fired. There was a real breakdown in communication between the employees and management. And once that got worked out and the communication was fixed, things were much smoother. So not everything was as salacious as the news media wants you to think. A lot of times it comes down to communication. Workplace violence, that's a situation where an employee makes a threat. We activate a threat assessment on that individual. It may require putting armed individuals in the office or the business to keep it secured until we can understand what threat that individual has. Then we'll do surveillance on that individual. Are they spending their weekend drinking and going to a gun store, or are they hanging out with their kids and going to the soccer game? All that kind of gives you a sense on the on how you're going to handle that assessment. So moving on to surveillance and to field investigations, talking about the different types that we'll have. Now, we've had all kinds of national investigations. We had a Chinese employee at a hedge fund who stole information. And the hedge fund wanted us to do surveillance to see who that individual was going to meet with. That's not a problem. We can do that. The problem was the individual employee didn't speak great English, and he had a 13-year-old son that did. And they wanted us to go to that house, knock on the door, and read a letter to the 13-year-old to read to his father. Obviously something we didn't want to do. So it's important to make sure when you sit on these phone calls with your investigators and yourselves and the clients don't really understand the ethical issues involved. I always say to my clients in those type of conversations, anything you're asking us to do, just assume it's in the cover of the New York Times and CNN tomorrow. And if it is, do you think that's going to be okay? How are you going to feel about that? And that usually will dictate for them how that's going to happen. Many times we get calls for employees that took a new job around the country and they signed a bonus and a relocation stipend, and they were supposed to stay for a year. Those employees decide after 6 months to skip and they move to some other location. We then need to find them. And as I indicated in the Miami case, we try to motivate them to say, listen, we find them, we let them know we know where they are. We try to identify why it's better for them to just negotiate the settlement than to take it into a further situation. And we have that in a lot of different situations. But investigations require a lot. We had a dentist who was being blackmailed by his dominatrix, and she was blackmailing him, hoping he would not tell his wife. I, of course, said to him, listen, there's been no intimate relationship here, maybe our best bet is to tell your wife what happened and just explain why no judgments. We all have different things we do in our life. And he goes, well, it really wasn't intimate. And then further in the conversation, he disclosed it was on occasion an intimate relationship, and he didn't want to disclose it to his wife. So we had to do due diligence on this woman in Ohio. And we had to go out there and find a way to show her that she was better off finding a path of least resistance and taking her efforts and her energy somewhere else. So field investigations and surveillance can involve a lot of different things. And you want to have a photograph. There's nothing worse than being told, hey, Bill, go do surveillance for me on that guy in the building. He's about 6 feet tall, 180 pounds, and he's in an apartment building with 400 people. So tactically, you want to understand when you do a field investigation, a Google Maps view will let you know if it's the kind of place you can go and set up with 1 or 2 people. How many investigators do you need? In cities like LA, San Francisco, New York City, you really need to have 2 people in 1 car, because you don't know if when the individual leaves the building, they're going to walk, take mass transit, take an Uber, or drive themselves. You have to have the ability for 1 person to stay or to jump should that become necessary. So knowing the environment's important. And again, I can't stress the photograph. A lot of different ways we can get photographs now, so have that. And knowing employment information, knowing how you're going to set up that surveillance. What is the purpose of the surveillance? Is it going to be good to do it during the week? Should we do it on the weekend? What's involved in that? I'm just looking at one of the questions that was posed to me. I'll get to that at the end. So the other thing to keep in mind is video. A lot of times you want video. Everyone wants to see video, right? We're in a very visual world. As I said, everyone's on TikTok and Instagram. They want to see that stuff all the time. So you hope to get video. Remember, though, a good investigator can still testify and be probative of the issues by what they observed. So obviously you want them to be professional in their appearance and how they articulate themselves and the impression they would make to a jury. So it's not only about the video, something they can testify. You also want to know when to shoot video and when not to shoot video. And it's important, depending upon your case sometimes, that once you shoot video of an individual, you want to keep that running the whole time. Because if you break the video at some point or stop or turn it off, that may give opposing counsel the opportunity to cross-examine your investigator and say, hey, you turned off the video because it began to show something that wasn't good for your case. So that's what you want to keep in mind. Also, the idea of reports, whether you're going to want a written report from the investigator or not. Do you think it's discoverable or not? What value is there in there? And that comes a lot too when we're talking about witness statements and how we're going to go about handling that part of it. Confirming an address is so important. And that's why DMV, as I talked earlier about how robust those records are now, because you want to really know where you're going when you start the investigation. It's important to have that as time efficient as possible. I remember years ago, we were doing an investigation again involving the animal rights groups, which were labeled as a terrorist organization because the amount of destruction they were doing, really giving the pharmaceuticals a hard time, destroying property and homes, intimidating employees, and sometimes shareholders. And so we had a large rally in New York City. We put undercovers. They were meeting in Central Park and then marching through the city. We had undercovers in the group. We had others in cars and surveillance documenting people in the group. And there was a couple of cars out there I couldn't recognize. And so I would take down those license plates. And again, that was all justifiable, permissible use of that information. And when I ran the license plate, it came back to 650 East 14th Street. And I'm thinking there is no 650 East 14th Street, which I found interesting. And then the next day, the general counsel for the pharmaceutical company called me up and said the FBI was requesting that I no longer run their plates. So I thought that was just kind of funny, but it shows you how, one, all these things are kept record of. You go and do something, somebody knows you're doing it. The other advice on a budget is you can't do it in 4 hours. You know, Rome wasn't built in a day. It's not like the first day you're going to go out, you're going to get the information you want. We do a lot of surveillance on character cases. Someone's going to invest with someone, or there's an asset search. Let's follow this person. Where are they going? What are they doing? Who are they meeting with? And a lot of times you got to put the time in, not that first day they're going to find them. And of course, COVID has thrown this all out of whack because of the fact that people are obviously working remotely now also. And if you have an opportunity, I'm going quicker now because I know we got about 10, 12 minutes. I want to get this all in. You have COVID has thrown that off because people are no longer working from their offices. They're not only working from their homes. People have found vacation homes, Airbnb to work at, Airbnbs to work at. That has also impacted the process. And so simply a day in the life means if you have a chance to do a deposition of someone who you're then going to want surveillance on, think of all the things you can ask them about their daily living that could be used for the surveillance. Who walks the dog? Who takes the kids to the school? Do you go to the gym? What car do you drive? What entrance of the building do you use if you're in a large apartment complex? So it's not a bad idea to confer sometimes with your investigator before a deposition to see what questions might be useful for that. Witness statements. Again, keeping in mind that investigator is your customer service rep. That witness today that we don't think is so important will be the key to our case 10 or 15 years later from now. No, not 10 or 15 years, kind of long, but I do have some cases 10, 11 years old. So make sure they make a good impression. And a lot of times when we go and get witness statements, what we do with the witness statement, I should have them for you, was obviously we get the person to give us a statement, we sign it and they sign it, and then we submit it. And then you have a deposition with that witness and you say to the witness, excuse me, Mrs. Smith, but isn't this your witness statement? Didn't you tell us this previously? And now you're saying something different. You show them the statement. And they go, is that your signature? And they go, yeah, I just signed it. That investigator, Belmont, came out. He was very professional. He was a very nice guy, very polite. But I kind of signed the statement just to appease him. So what we do is we always put a typo or two in the statement. And when the witness is reading it, we have them cross out that typo and initial it. Now, when you have that same witness in front of you, you can go, well, Mrs. Smith, I appreciate that, but you really did read it right, because Mr. Belmont, as professional as he was, he made a typo here and you caught that and you initialed it. So we found that little nuance to be helpful in that case. And again, sometimes we get a statement from a witness and it's really bad and the attorney's like, don't have them sign anything. Well, maybe sometimes you want to contain that damage. Maybe you want them to sign that. You have them sign that actual statement, so later on it couldn't get worse. But again, that's a strategy to keep in mind, as well as making sure you get contact information. Remember from earlier on, we need 2 or 4 things: name, address, date of birth, and social. So hopefully when you get that witness's information in the beginning, you hold on to it. And cell phone numbers, now people will give away their firstborn before they'll change their cell phone number. So as much as you can have is important to have. So later on, and I am telling you, you'd be surprised a number of times clients will call me because they can't find a witness, or their own client sometime years later. So it's a good way to keep track of that information. Direct contact investigations, as we talked about. I will tell you, a lot of times when you're locating someone, and to tie into the question Brian asked me, can we get a good cost of using various tools? Yes. So locate investigation typically costs between $300 and $500 to locate someone. But then if you need a phone number or you need an address, phone numbers are not as easily available now as they were back in the day of the yellow pages. So sometimes you have to go a little bit further, find out who's paying for certain records at certain locations to gather the information. So that's typically where the ranges in a located investigation. Surveillances can typically range anywhere from 100, maybe 75 to 125 an hour to do your investigation. So that's a good way to gauge cost on that and what the miles would be. And then scene investigations. No matter what the scene may be, no matter what the investigation is, you may need photos and measurements. I've been telling clients a lot of times now, you can use Google Maps and take a screenshot. Remember, a witness can testify to anything that's a fair and accurate depiction of what it looked like. So if Google Maps can do that, you can do it, but they're always more comfortable having it. We're training our guys and gals to go out there and always take 360-degree photographs. You go from 6 inches to 16 feet to 60 feet. I explained to them when they go out there as investigators, you have to take those pictures to imagine that that area in 3 years from now will be removed. It'll be changed, it'll be altered. Your pictures are the only way for that attorney to tell that story in front of a jury. And I remember from being in front of a jury how important it is to use visual tools when doing that type of process. CCTV is huge. They're everywhere now. And you're seeing, again, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook Live. People are making videos of things. Everyone has these Ring doorbells now, and Ring doorbells becoming even a bigger part of the process, documenting that. So the sooner you can get out, get your investigator to the scene after the accident, the sooner you get access to these CCTVs, these videos, these Ring doorbells. Get the incident reports, not just government agencies. Maybe it took place on private property. Somebody documented what took place somewhere, try and get it. And I've been using more and more, which I thought was a very useful tool. We put signs up. You know how people put signs up? Hey, look for my dog. I can't find my dog. Put the same sign up. Hey, there was an accident on June 2nd at 2 p.m. If you saw something, call us. See, a lot of times we get sent to an accident scene. An incident took place, I'm not even sure what date it is now. An incident took place yesterday, and they say, get out there. We get out to the accident scene, or we get out to the scene where the incident took place today, and we're talking to people because it came out quickly. You always want to go back on the same day and time of an incident. So though you may run out on Wednesday, if it took place Tuesday at noon or Tuesday at 9 o'clock, you got to get back there at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday, because people are creatures of habit. They're walking the dog. They're coming home from work. They're getting their dinner. Asset searches, we touched on this earlier. So these are the different areas or categories of information for asset searches. Judgments, liens, all these different things listed here will give you information on that asset. We get these all the time now. People are getting judgments. Many times they want to call us before they even get into litigation. Hey, Bill, is this going to be worth the fight? How much might be at the end of the rainbow for me? Other times the IP lawyers want us to do it. They want to go after someone's trademark, or someone's going after their mark, and they want to know how big a fight they may have. This is one tool that may give you some insight to that. Obviously, we have different tools we can use, whether it's pre or post judgment. And international, as I told you earlier, is a whole nother ballgame. Everything outside this country, Eastern Europe, Latin America, much more difficult to gather information than it is in the US. No one has as much as the US. GDPR, the General Data Protection Act. I know California, the European General Data Protection Regulation. California's picked up its version of it. For those attorneys that work on that, you have my sympathy. It is very tedious. It's the protection of data, especially for those that have clients here and in Europe. That's for the whole country. California now is creating its own regulations in this area. Just important to remember the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The same thing I said about knowing about your investigator when you're here in the States. You want to make sure if you're doing international work, you're doing stuff with reputable individuals who understand ethics and integrity, and making sure you don't violate privacy rights. And thinking outside the box. You know, if you have a case, it's, I sometimes say to my clients, if there was a person out there, if you could describe an individual that might know what you want to know, who would that person be? Where would they be situated? What would their position be? Let us know that. We can see if we can try and find them. And some of the technology out there now are GPS tracking devices. Depending upon your jurisdiction, they are utilized. Cell phone pinging, the ability to identify someone's location by cell phone, not readily available legally in the commercial sector, extremely accurate in law enforcement. That technology is excellent. You don't see a lot of drones out there now. People keep asking me, can you do surveillance by drone? We don't. Cities regulate that. But in other parts of the country, farmers are using it. Individuals who own a large part of property are using that. They put their drone out there. Instead of putting their vehicles or their ATVs in the farmlands, they can fly their drone to see what's going on in those areas. LPRs are license plate readers. We do have access to that. If I'm looking for Joe Smith and I can't find him, and I know his license plate, there are systems available to us that we can put his license plate in, and it'll show us where his license plate is showing up. The way that works is just like with Google Maps, someone's driving around taking pictures. These companies drive around the country taking photographs of license plates parked in public areas and not taking private property photographs. And they're documenting it. We're getting access to that. And traditional investigations still exist. People are still out there doing dumpster dives. So they are still out there. People who aren't shredding information. I think the word I think we learned in law school was curtilage. So if it's in a public area and it's available, you can take it. It's used often still in counterfeiting cases and intellectual property cases to identify what information is available.
So we have a couple of questions. How do you locate credit union accounts or small accounts at small banks versus accounts at big banks? And are you able to get any of that bank information short of a subpoena, either before the case is started, during the case, or after a case is already?
There's more freedom post-judgment. So depending on the type of case in the jurisdiction, you can, if you have a judgment, utilize that information. There is no difference between all larger or smaller accounts.
So you do searches to find bank accounts? It
Yes.
Doesn't matter whether it's a credit union or a small bank?
Correct. Let's just call them financial accounts post-judgment.
Are you able to get bank records, or does that all have to be subpoenaed?
No, if it's post-judgment, there are tools out there that you can do it. Pre-judgment, you cannot.
Thank you.
And then and again, on the ethics part, we just talked about the cell phone rules and records as far as that not being available. And should I be checking for? I kind of went quick there in the end, just to make sure I got all the information in there.
You did very well. I don't know if anybody has any further questions or if you have any further comments at this time.
Let's just see what I might have skipped over.
Maybe some of the cost of doing some of this. There seems to be a lot of work, and people think, wow, this is great. You've got a lot of tools. How much is this going to cost my client? Like if I do an asset search, or if I do.
Right. So I can answer that for you. So a typical, what I would call a phase one due diligence. You come to me and say, Bill, I'm in litigation. Here's an example. I had a guy in LA. He was being sued in a paternity suit. Made no sense to him. Client and attorney said, what can we do? I said, let's just go look into this woman a little bit. And we look into her, and every year she's a serial suer. She just chooses a guy. So by doing a litigation search, we found that. So typically you can open up a person's life with a pretty comfortable amount of information for between $3,000 and $5,000. And that's the same information, whether it's a litigation adversary or someone who's making a financial deal. Now, sometimes that 5,000 can turn to 10 or 15 because you're interviewing people and pulling records. But I'd say 80% of the time, maybe 85% of the time, for $3,000 to $5,000, you're getting what you need to be comfortable with either your litigation decisions or your investment decisions. Asset searches are maybe a little bit less because you're not pulling the same amount of information, but again, it puts you into the same area. Unless you're going post-judgment and you're looking for those financial assets you talked about, then you can be talking $5,000, $10,000, $20,000, depending upon the cases. And then if you're going international and the money's being hitting offshore, it can get into 5 or 6 figures. And there's also
social media searches.
We don't usually one off them, but you could get those done for $700, $750. And the other thing that's available, which I'm happy you brought up too, is dark web searches. So that now is becoming available too, especially with these cryptocurrency cases. Those are significant in cost. When you start getting into the dark web, you're talking about hearts and mind investigations. Those can be like $50,000 or $100,000 a month investigations.
What does that investigation entail? Can you give me?
So let's say you have a guy that you're trying to sell your house, Brian, right? And your neighbor, you want to buy your neighbor's house and he won't sell it to you because he doesn't think highly of you. You can actually create a campaign. So this individual, when he goes to Starbucks and when he goes on the internet, he now changes his opinion of you. So this whole Hearts and Mind campaign that was being utilized internationally with war with the Middle East and changing people's perspective has worked its way into the commercial sector. The cryptocurrency and fraud cases now are often taking place in the dark web. So you have to go into the dark web to maybe identify that fraudster. You have to create a secondary fraud for him. So he tries to engage with you there. And then that's how you go ahead and you identify him there. If you saw the FBI just recently in that case was able to identify the Atom app that they utilized to track all these criminal enterprises. 1,000 people got arrested because they thought the government wasn't tracking them, and they gathered all that information.
This has been an outstanding presentation. We are at the hour. If you want to add anything further, now is the time. Otherwise, we could just conclude the program at this time.
I just apologize for talking like a New Yorker, but I wanted to get as much in as I could, and I appreciate speaking. If anybody has questions, obviously, about anything, I'm happy to point you in the direction.
You are outstanding, and thank you very much for your time and all the information that you provided. We look forward to using your services in the future.
Thank you.